Now, with regards to the funeral process itself, and this is the pamphlet that was prepared that you have, funerals are actually a process. It's not a moment, it's a process. And there are three key elements, phases, or moments in this process: the visitation, the funeral liturgy, and the burial. And so in your pamphlet, these various elements are described. The visitation is really a time for looking back. That is the key period where people get together and they speak about the deceased. And that is where we will usually see lots of photos, little videos, people talking about what a great guy he was or what a wonderful woman she was. It's a time of looking back, of appropriating the past, reappropriating the past, bringing it into the present. That's its key function. Here in Canada, we very often do it at a funeral home. In most cultures of the world, it's been done in actual homes. You would wake the person in the living room. Priests nowadays, we often get waked in church, actually. That's what the custom is around priests, I guess, because that was their home where they worked so much and had so much of their life. But usually it's in the funeral home itself. Then there is the funeral liturgy. This is the key moment. It's the central moment where we are asking God to bring this person into the fullness of the kingdom. So what I usually tell people at a funeral liturgy is I say, we've had a chance to look back. Now it's time to turn around and look forward. It's time. That's what the purpose of the funeral liturgy is. To start to shift our gaze from the past to the future. Customarily, this is done with a Mass. It's important to do it with a Mass because, again, the Mass is a renewal of the death and resurrection of Christ. It's the living Jesus who comes to us in the Mass. And so we are asking the Lord to save the dead person, to bring them into his kingdom. It's not just any other kind of prayer service. It's the sacrifice of Christ on the cross being applied, that redemption being applied to that person. Very, very powerful prayer moment within the context of our spirituality. There are a few awkward questions that sometimes arise. If a person wants to have the funeral liturgy for whatever reason in a funeral home, I told you the story of my very first one, and that was in a funeral home. It's possible, but under our norms, we don't do a Mass in a funeral home. And people are sometimes confused because they see it's a chapel. They say, well, it's a chapel. Why can't you do Mass in the chapel? And the answer is it's not really a chapel. What it is a corporation that has built a meeting room that evokes the image of a chapel, but it's not actually a chapel, and we don't want our liturgy to be part of their corporate business plan. You see? So we don't do Mass. We can do prayers anywhere, obviously. We'll pray. But the Mass, the sacrifice of the Mass, that really should be in our churches. That's really where it should be. It's the church, the physical building, is a symbol of heaven. It's a symbol of coming home to God. And so it's most appropriate to have a Mass, and it's most appropriate to have that Mass in a church for those reasons. But again, that doesn't mean that we won't pray in other places. I'm very happy to go and pray, because sometimes I know it might be a family where faith is not strong, but who knows what transformation can come through it. I lived it, my very first one, so I know that it is possible. With regards to the burial, we bury a person in the earth because in the biblical story we were created from the dust of the earth. You are dust, and unto dust you will return. And so we go back to the earth. We can also be buried in a mausoleum. Those of Italian extraction, there are a number of mausoleums, and it's often the tradition to bury a person in a mausoleum. And that's okay too. It's evocative of the passage in the scriptures where Jesus says he has gone on to the Father's house where there are many rooms, and he prepares a place for us. So that mausoleum is in a sense an image of the Father's house, a place being prepared for us. There are other customs as well that exist, being buried at sea, for example, that also exists. we bury the body. Sometimes there is cremation. And in that case, we bury the ashes, or the ashes are placed in the mausoleum. But it's important that we understand it is truly the person in their integrity that is being laid to rest. With cremation especially, we're starting to see some curious customs. The scattering of ashes, okay? Or even creating small souvenir urns. You can buy a big urn with a bunch of small ones so everybody gets a piece of the ashes to bring home. Oh no, this exists. This exists. And with cremation, we're finding that when people do that, the closure doesn't happen. If you've still got mom or dad with you, sometimes even just a piece, you don't have that closure. And if the ashes are scattered, let's say on the river, you have no place to go for a subsequent visit. Closure becomes the same thing as forgetting about it, which is not closure. And so we're finding that people are experiencing this in unhealthy ways. Even cremation, one thing that happens sometimes, and this is going to sound odd, but it's true, people don't always come to pick up the ashes. If you've got a body, it's got to be buried. If you've got ashes, you can wait, and wait, and wait. I was in a parish once where a funeral home called and said, the funeral director was a man of faith, and he said, I have a problem. I have all these ashes that nobody's come to pick up, and my bosses at the funeral home told me to get rid of them because they were taking up space. So I brought them all home and they're in my garage. What do I do with them? We laugh, but it's tragic. You know, the idea is the person died, we had the body incinerated, you know, so the ashes cremated, the ashes are there, and we're not even going to go to the next step. That's not really saying goodbye at all. That's saying good riddance. That's not the same thing. Our funeral traditions require us to have a place and have a mechanism to truly say goodbye all the way, which is why cremation is permitted, but you have to bury everything. And it has to get buried. That is part of our tradition. There's no question about it. I actually was chatting with a Muslim individual at one point, and he said to me, and this shows the gravity of the question. He said to me, you Catholics, I don't see why you don't believe in the resurrection anymore. You used to. I said to him, well, I can assure you that we still do. Of course, Muslims believe in the resurrection too. I said, I can assure you we still do. And he said, well then, how come you're all cremating people now? You know, if you really believe in the resurrection of the body, you should honor the body more. That was his instinct. Now, again, we do allow cremation, and honestly, you know, cremation in our history has always been allowed on a limited scale, particularly if the person who died had a disease, communicable disease. You had to cremate, there was no question. But there is something there. We want to make sure that our traditions honor the body and don't take away our faith in the resurrection. Remembering the deceased is important. Actually, I'm just going to go back and finish those points there. Common questions. Non-Catholics having a Catholic funeral? Yes, it is possible. We will do a funeral for a non-Catholic Christian, particularly. We'll pray for anybody. But for funerals themselves, we'll do them for non-Catholic Christians who share the faith of the resurrection, as long as it's understood it wouldn't be something contrary to their own beliefs. That would be disrespectful to them, obviously. We don't want to ever go contrary to that. And the question of cremation I have already addressed.